Hello, Locust Lou. Today, just for you, I'm going to read Mr. Noisy, which your mummy tells me is your favourite Mr. Man book. So let's get started. Auntie Katie has her noisy earrings on today. So we will get started with Mr. Noisy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is very loud, is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. There's Mr. Noisy reading Mr. Noisy the book. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But, a tissue! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear them in the next country. There's Mr. Noisy sneezing. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed. In his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. There's Mr. Noisy's house on top of the hill. He was snoring. And as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. That's Mr. Noisy snoring. It's very loud indeed, isn't it? Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Wee-yaw, 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 wee-yaw. Mr. Noisy woke up. And so did too all of the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. There's his alarm clock going off like a fire engine. Wee-yaw, wee-yaw, wee-yaw. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. There's Mr. Noisy being noisy to the butcher. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We merely must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. There's Mrs. Crumb and there's Mr. Bacon the butcher. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping down Wobbletown. Clump, clump, clump. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. Sorry, what did you say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted. "Sorry," said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. "Can you speak up, please?" "I'd like a loaf of bread," roared Mr. Nosey. "Can't hear you," replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. There's Mr. Noisy getting out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. "I'd like a piece of meat," he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. "I'd like a piece of meat," Mr. Noisy shouted. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon. "I said I'd like a piece of meat," roared Mr. Noisy. "Pardon?" said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out, and went home and went to bed, hungry. There he is, with his sad face, walking out because he didn't get his piece of meat or his bread. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. "I'd like a loaf of bread," he boomed. "A what?" asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice, "A loaf of—" And then he stopped. And then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb." Mrs. Crumb smiled. "Certainly," she said. There's Mrs. Crumb smiling. Then Mr. Nosy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. "I'd like a piece of meat," he boomed. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon. "Yes, I did," shouted Mr. Noisy at the very top of his voice. "I said I'd like a—" And then he stopped and he thought. And then he said quietly, "I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon." Mr. Bacon smiled. "My pleasure," he said. There's Mr. Bacon smiling. So, carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off up the hill. Clomp, clomp, clomp. Very noisy. And then he stopped and he thought. And then, do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something that Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was so fun. Can you hear me tiptoeing? That's because I'm very quiet. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door, and then he stopped. And then he thought, and then, do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside, and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before either. That was fun too. There he is, being a little bit more quiet. And do you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Baker. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper. Do you know how to whisper? I like whispering. Mr. Noisy by Roger Hargreaves.